For centuries, Europeans have downed large quantities of alcohol. It was a ubiquitous and essential part of the 17th century European life. It wasn't just indulged in at home, but at public alehouses and taverns. The water supply at this time was often contaminated, and fermented beverages such as beer, ale, cider, and wine became a very popular alternative. When Europeans began to migrate to North America in the early 1600s, they brought along their hearty drinking habits. English colonists in Massachusetts and Virginia imported beer, but this was expensive, and for some time they brewed their own. After 1700, the colonists fermented peach juice, hard apple cider, and rum, which they imported from the West Indies, or distilled from West Indian molasses. In Virginia, there was a carefree attitude about alcohol. Drinking was an important part of the culture, and people passed around jugs of liquor at barbecues on market days and at elections. Political candidates gave away free drinks. A stingy candidate had no chance of winning. Practically everyone drank. Even the more restrained New Englanders consumed large quantities of liquor. The Puritans called it a good creature of God, a holy substance, to be taken proudly yet cautiously. By 1770, Americans consumed alcohol, mostly rum and cider, routinely with every meal. Many people began their day and ended their day with a drink. People of all ages drank, including toddlers who finished off a heavily sugared portion at the bottom of a parent's mug of rum. Each person consumed about 3.5 gallons of alcohol per year, which is double the present rate of consumption. This all changed with the American Revolution. When the British blockade of the seacoast began, it cut off molasses and rum imports. Americans had to find a substitute. The Scotch-Irish immigrants who settled on the western frontiers had brought whiskey with them from Ulster and the Scottish lowlands. After the Revolution, whiskey began to replace rum, since the British refused to supply it, and the new federal government began to tax it in the 1790s. Whiskey also thrived because it was cheap. The settlement of the Corn Belt in Kentucky and Ohio created an abundance of corn. The farmers could make no profit shipping corn overland to the eastern market, so they distilled corn into liquid acids. By the 1820s, whiskey sold for 25 cents a gallon, making it cheaper than beer, wine, coffee, tea, or milk. Whiskey was also less dangerous than water, which was frequently contaminated. This made it increasingly popular at the time. Liquor consumption was at an all-time high. Americans often stopped their day at 11 a.m. to drink. A lot of work became undone, and excessive drunkenness was widespread. There soon began to be a growing opposition to alcohol. The earliest attacks on alcohol came during the late 1700s from Methodists and Quakers. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a predominant Philadelphia physician, led the first temperance movement. Rush believed that the overuse of hard liquor was unhealthy, but smaller quantities of weak mixed drinks were harmless. Most Americans at the time ignored this idea, and liquor remained a major part of everyday life. Many Protestant ministers shifted the attack against alcohol from the issue of health to the question of sin. Rather than promoting drinking in moderation, they demanded total abstinence from alcohol. Some churches required members to take a pledge to not drink at all. By 1850, the consumption of alcohol had dropped by more than half. This did not mean that the average American only drank half as much, but rather half of the population had stopped drinking completely. The other half continued to drink just as they did before the temperance movement. The temperance movement leaders had resorted to government power to coerce the remaining drinkers to give up liquor. Temperance became prohibition, and in 1838 Massachusetts passed the first prohibition law banning the sale of hard liquor in any quantity under 15 gallons. Retailers dodged the law. One seller sold tickets to see his blind pig, and anyone who bought the tickets would get a free drink with it. This was the origin of the term blind pig, which was used to describe an illegal drinking establishment. The prohibition law had proven to be ineffective, and 2 years later the statute was repealed, and people went back to drinking the way they did. Other prohibitionists attempted to enact laws against alcohol, but they all found that enforcement was impossible, and thus were unsuccessful. Around this time there was large waves of immigrants from Germany coming to the United States, who brought with them their beer. During the Civil War, Northern soldiers turned from the traditional hard liquor to a preferred new German light lager beer. The new lager beer enjoyed great popularity after the war, and this period saw the emergence of today's largest breweries, including Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz, Pabst, and Miller. Although the Protestant majority saw these Catholic immigrants as immoral interlopers, bringing their booze and corrupt goods to Anglo-Saxon Americans. Several women living in small towns in Ohio began the Women's Crusade, a temperance campaign which fought against what they saw as the dangers of alcoholism. Locking support locally, prominent women invaded all male saloons and would drop to their knees saying loud prayers. They demanded that each saloon be closed. The Women's Temperance Union became the largest women's organization and advocated making children take the pledge, banning drinkers from jobs, and legislating for prohibition. In 1914, World War I broke out. German-American brewers lost their political effectiveness amidst the anti-German hysteria that was brewing at the time. In 1917, prohibitionists persuaded Congress to pass a temporary wartime dry law. Food was in short supply, and anti-liquor forces warned that brewing or distilling grain threatened the war effort. This led to the proposal of the 18th Amendment, which took effect after 3/4 of the states ratified it in 1920. This amendment did have its oddities. It outlawed the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquor for beverage purposes, but did not prohibit consumption. However, the law did reduce consumption by about half, and began to change how people drank. The saloon began to disappear and was soon replaced with the speakeasy, where men and women drank together out of teacups. People began to drink in hotel rooms and in private homes where arrest was unlikely. Liquor was largely imported illegally from Canada. Rum runners' boats outraced the Coast Guard, and Canadian distillers Hiram Walker and Seagram's are still major forces in the American industry today. By the late 1920s, because of corrupt prohibition agents and public opposition to the 18th Amendment, it was impossible to enforce. The black market was thriving, and Al Capone was making an estimated $200 million a year. Although Herbert Hoover called prohibition a noble experiment, a sense of exasperation about prohibition was growing. In 1933, Congress passed and the states ratified the 21st Amendment, which ended America's dry years. Newly elected FDR celebrated by mixing a martini in the White House. However, the Prohibition era had a major effect on alcohol culture in America. The end of Prohibition did not mean a resurgence of the saloon, and many states, especially in the South and in the Midwest, prohibited sales of alcohol by the drink, while other states discouraged consumption by creating state liquor stores that restricted alcohol advertising and selling hours. Both the federal government and the states imposed high taxes on alcoholic drinks. From the 50s to the 70s, alcoholic consumption rose steadily. After World War II, the economic boom stimulated the market. Drinking styles changed. Not only did people drink, they drank more. Regional brewers collapsed under pressure from half a dozen nationally advertised giants, Anheuser-Busch became the industry leader by the early decision to sponsor sporting events on television and created a huge market for light beers. With the rise of car-centric America, liquor-related teen auto accidents then also grew rapidly. Intoxicated drivers caused about half of nearly 50,000 automobile accident fatalities. Physical addiction became a problem for older teens who had only been drinking a few years. Patterns of alcohol abuse that took over a decade or more to develop in adults emerged among teens in far shorter periods. This created a backlash against teen drinking. Mothers Against Drink Driving (MADD) lobbied to raise the drinking age to 21. Eventually, Congress forced the states to adopt such a policy. State legislators also imposed stricter definitions of legal drunkenness. Those convicted of driving under the influence had their licenses removed and could spend time in jail. Many Americans tend to drink in more dysfunctional ways than people in other societies. Americans aged 15 and up drink only 3/4 as much alcohol as their European counterparts, but are far more likely to be involved in a fatal alcohol-related accident or to die from other alcohol-related causes. The early Americans enjoyed having a drink and socializing at an alehouse, but the decline of the alehouse and the saloon and the stigmatization of alcohol forced people to resort to binge drinking in their private homes, led to the alcohol culture that we see today. Psychologists from the University of Oxford have found that bonding over a pint carries serious mental health benefits. Researchers discovered over 1 in 3 men don't make enough time with their friends at least once a week in an era of increasing isolation. Prioritizing your social life is crucial to keeping loneliness at bay. Let's bring back public houses that promote drinking in a social healthy setting, ones that make sitting there enjoyable.